afternoon. This House has considered the reclassification of synthetic cannabinoids. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship for the first time, Mr Howarth, and I'm grateful for the opportunity in this debate to raise this important issue and to I'd like to thank the Backbench Business Committee for allowing me to do so this morning. I'm continuing this campaign for the reclassification of synthetic cannabinoids known as synthetic cannabis, Mamba or spice. These drugs are becoming a serious national problem. I want to raise the profile of this issue to make people aware of the devastating impact that these drugs have in my constituency of Mansfield, but right across the entire UK. It's time to take proper action on these drugs and to get Mamba and spice off our streets. Contrary to the assumption of some in Parliament, I don't believe that reclassification is a silver bullet, and I don't think it's a quick fix answer. In recent correspondence with the Minister for Public Health and Primary Care, he stated, synthetic cannabinoid use is often part of a complex set of health and social issues. There is no single solution, and short-term approaches can just displace the problem. I share this sentiment, and we clearly need a holistic approach in dealing with these drugs. However, whilst not being the only solution, reclassification is a step in the right direction to give our police and local services the power that they need to effectively deal with users and dealers. The current Class B classification is limiting the action that local services and the police can take, which is further damaging some of our most deprived areas where resources are already stretched. I'll give way.
Just that point that you said about giving police more powers, reclassifying what we're telling SCRAs, synthetic cannabinoid receptor agonists, as Class A drugs would not grant any additional enforcement powers to the police.
Thank you for his intervention. I disagree. My local police are absolutely adamant that they have more powers on the street in the town centre to deal with issues like heroin use than they do these particular drugs. And that actually, not only obviously are the sentencing powers and issues to the judicial system different, but at the minute when they deal with issues like Mamba and spice in Mansfield town centre, they don't actually work on drugs offences. They deal with antisocial behaviour, criminal behaviour orders, because they don't have the opportunity through drugs legislation to actually record these as offences. I'll give way.
I'm grateful to him for giving way, and I'd like to reinforce the point he's making isn't the fact that so many police commissioners are writing to us, calling for us to make the very changes that he suggests. Reinforce the point that actually police will put greater priority on this if it is reclassified as a Class A drug.
Thank him for his intervention. He's absolutely right. In the wake of an adjournment debate I held in this space back in July, 20 police and crime commissioners wrote to the Minister about this issue, stressing exactly what I'm saying this morning, that unless this drug is taken seriously and is prioritised by the police forces in the way that Class A drugs are, that they are struggling to deal with it on a local level. The point of reclassification is not to criminalise vulnerable users, it's to prevent those users from being exploited by drug dealers to get them the help that they need. The Health Minister's Green Paper entitled Prevention is Better Than Cure that we've seen this week was announced just yesterday is a welcome development, and as the Health Secretary said, focusing on responsibilities of patients isn't about penalising people, it's about helping people to make better choices.
Just before he gets too much into the patients, can I bring him back to the issue of policing? My local police have been doing a phenomenal bit of work cracking down on drug activity, a number of arrests last week. One of their concerns is that they don't have strong enough sentencing for the drugs barons at the top, who too often get let away, basically scot-free. Does my right honourable friend agree that this reclassification should be coupled with stronger sentencing for those who are peddling these drugs?
I thank my honourable friend for that intervention, and she's right. I think the challenge in many cases is that there don't seem to be significant repercussions for dealing and manufacturing these products. And that actually, I will touch on local examples a little bit later on about people who've gone round and round the judicial system with a week's sentence for this, 8 weeks for that, where actually not only are the drugs more available in prison often than they are on the streets, but actually there is no long-term repercussion for continuing to flout these laws and people just go round and round the system.
One more time, just on the issue of prison. I visited my prison last Friday, and indeed they're also doing great work getting the drugs out. But the prison governor also asked for stronger sentences for those prisoners that commit crimes, especially violent crimes, in prison, and that those sentences should be additional, not concurrent sentences. Does my honourable friend agree?
I think it's a fair point. I thank you for your intervention. And I, for one, would like to see drug dealers and manufacturers removed from our streets for as long as possible. So I absolutely concur. I think as part of my constituency work, I focused heavily in the last year or so on homelessness in Mansfield and Warsop. And I think that, just going back to the health funding aspect, that we can use that announcement from the Health Secretary this week and that funding that's available for our NHS in the coming years to explore ways in which we can put in place community and primary care services for homeless and vulnerable people and for these drugs preventative services. For me, that preventative aspect is exactly what is needed for that funding and what can make a big impact on this particular issue. As I said at the start, reclassification for me is not the silver bullet, it's not the only answer. It comes with a need for preventative services in our communities, and they are two sides, to me, of the same coin in terms of delivering for my constituents on this issue. The Mansfield District Council and local police have done everything they can to help users under the current framework. I commend them for their hard work and dedication on this issue. Alongside local charity framework, the council and the police have launched a joint operation to tackle antisocial behaviour related to the use of Mamba. And in the town centre alone, there's now 1 sergeant, 6 constables and 6 PCSOs working closely with the council's neighbourhood wardens and antisocial behaviour officers to deal with the problem, in addition to CCTV. This demonstrates the enormity of the issue. There are more police officers working in the town centre than perhaps ever before, but they're still being stretched by this problem, and still some kind of drug-related episode, whether it's somebody passing out or causing some other kind of issue for residents, is a daily occurrence. It's important to recognise we shouldn't automatically assume all homeless people are taking these drugs. Of course, they're not. But due to the incredibly low cost, there is a high correlation, and it has, to some extent, become the drug of choice. A dedicated task force is focusing on the root causes of homelessness by giving individuals the support they need to end the cycle of dependency on drugs and alcohol and help them turn their lives around. 3 outreach workers who specialise in homelessness, mental health and substance misuse are supporting the community in Mansfield to try and build relationships with these users, even when their help is rejected, as it often is. Mansfield is learning from projects in other areas in order to work on its own best practice when dealing with this. More than 50 people shared their experience at a recent Mamba seminar, which will provide further guidance for the local authority. I myself have met with the Nottingham Mamba Clinic to explore new approaches, hear their experience, and try to share their work in my own constituency. Interestingly, even the drugs workers on the ground in the Nottingham Mamba Clinic agree that reclassification is an important aspect in terms of managing this problem locally. A local police inspector, Nick Butler, in my own constituency, has said that the College of Policing has acknowledged that Mansfield is leading the way in terms of dealing with Mamba users, tackling antisocial behaviour and rough sleeping, which is commendable. But we must accept the fact that it gets to the point where enough is enough in some cases. Whilst we can offer help to individuals until we're blue in the face, the fact of the matter is people can refuse help, or sometimes for a variety of complex reasons are not able to accept help, and instead end up in an endless cycle of reoffending. We've reached a point where existing powers to deal with repeat offenders are no longer having an impact, and local police are calling for further support, as we've seen in the example of the Police and Crime Commissioners writing to government. We're following on from my debate in July about the societal impact of these drugs. I asked government for 2 things. Firstly, a national strategy to share best practice, seek medical intervention and to support local areas in combating this issue. And secondly, to consider reclassifying these drugs from Class B, comparable with cannabis, to Class A, in line with heroin. I will be there.
Member for giving way and congratulate him on the debate. On the issue of best practice, I think hopefully all of us would agree that that is something that should be endorsed. But would you agree with me that we need wider communities across all of our urban, particularly communities, but as well rural, that those communities have to buy into that best practice process in order that they see evidence in terms of the outcome, whether it's in court, police action or wider community resistance to this sort of activity?
Thank you for his intervention. I agree, and what we all want to see ultimately is those tangible outcomes on the ground in our communities. It's absolutely the case that obviously we can set legislation here, we can change classification, but it has to be bought into, it has to be delivered by those local service providers and the police on the ground. And I, for one, prioritise, the most important thing for me is that my constituents in Mansfield Town Centre feel safer as a result. That's exactly what we are after. In the aftermath of that debate, 20 Police and Crime Commissioners wrote to government in support of reclassification. It's also received cross-party support and backed by my local police leaders and by Nottinghamshire County Council and other county councils across the country who have written to government on this issue. It was originally sold as a legal high, and synthetic cannabinoids were developed as an alternative to cannabis, which leads to a common misconception that these drugs are not hard drugs. It's understandable they would have initially been made Class B. However, the comparison of synthetic cannabinoids to cannabis is entirely inaccurate, and the impacts are very different. I can't emphasise enough that reclassifying these drugs has no connection with cannabis or medical marijuana. There's a great deal of sense, in my view, in the medicinal use of cannabis in some cases. I don't argue with that, and I don't seek in this debate to suggest anything at all about cannabis, frankly. In fact, I want to make the point that the two are not comparable, and that these psychoactive drugs are not the same thing at all. We need to stop treating cannabis and synthetic cannabis as if they are the same thing, and we need to reclassify synthetic cannabis. It doesn't make sense that, in accordance with the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, synthetic cannabinoids are separated into the same class as cannabis in terms of relative harmfulness. The physical and psychological impacts are more comparable with Class A drugs like ketamine or heroin, yet the seriousness is not reflected in law. Seizures, heart attacks, chest pains are common physical problems. Users can experience frightening visions or hallucinations. I will give way.
Thank you for giving way yet again. He's making a really important point. I heard a tragic story when I visited the prison that 3 prisoners have recently died after taking drugs. All 3 were also taking epilepsy drugs, and sometimes there may be an issue that these drugs, we simply do not know what they do or how they interact with other more common medicines. Is this not another reason for treating this more seriously?
Thank you for the intervention. I absolutely agree. We've seen the impact of these drugs not only in users, but actually examples of prison officers having to go home sick themselves from having inhaled fumes from other people taking these drugs. The impact is not just on users themselves, but on the broader community, and absolutely another reason why this needs to be taken more seriously. It's not necessarily yet recognised in the kind of literature around this subject, but even as far as bleeding from the eyes and other orifices, teeth falling out, have been described by long-term users as side effects of this drug, and they are not comparable with outcomes and side effects of other Class B drugs. It's ridiculous that these symptoms do not warrant a higher classification. But unlike natural cannabis, synthetic cannabinoid receptor agonists, or SCRAs, do not contain cannabidiol, CBD, that we sometimes see in our high street and sold in shops. So a chemical which appears to possess antipsychotic properties. But the psychotic symptoms that occur relatively frequently following SCRA consumption might be linked to the high potency of the drugs, the absence of CBD. But in many cases, we don't actually know what's in it. This is part of why it's so difficult to have a clear national treatment plan for users. It's manufactured locally, ingredients vary across regions. Sometimes it's actually mainly nail varnish remover, other times not, and the impact, both in terms of health and in symptoms, can vary greatly. The case has been reported where users actually choose to take heroin instead of Mamba as there's more treatment available. There's no substitute for Mamba in the way that methadone can be used to help addicts to come off heroin. I've been told by service providers off the record that they would prefer to treat people who take heroin as their understanding is greater, the pathways are clearer in terms of support and help. And the idea that drugs workers would be saying, actually, I would rather you take this Class A drug than a Class B one, suggests that we haven't got this right at the current time. Anecdotally, I've been told these drugs are far more addictive than heroin or cocaine. An article in The Economist emphasised the difficulty faced by outreach workers as they tried to help users. And whilst heroin addicts often have 4 or 5 hours of lucidity a day, Mambas often chain smoke continuously throughout the day. And as you can imagine, this makes having a coherent conversation with a Mamba user a nearly impossible task. The Sunday Times this weekend contained a very interesting article by Rosamund Irwin, who described an account from a user as how much worse the outcomes of taking spice were compared with any other drug. In an article, Karen from Blackpool said, I've been on heroin for over 30 years, I've tried every drug, and spice is by far the most horrible. You can function on heroin, but on spice, I felt like I was coming off the world. In the same article, Karina from the Salvation Army says that drugs rob people of their personality. It's different to heroin in that you can still have a conversation with a heroin user, but when people are on spice, their body is there, but they are not. The impact of these drugs is immense and affect towns across the whole of the UK. Not only is the impact on individuals worse than many existing Class A drugs, but the impact on others and on public safety is arguably the worst aspect. I want to see heavier penalties for manufacturers and dealers. I want to see work done to shut down supply chains for these ingredients. And I want to see that increased risk and difficulty make life harder for manufacturers. In the meantime, I want police to be able to act to keep people safe on our streets. I've spoken to many local services in Mansfield and Nottinghamshire and seen firsthand the impact of these drugs on our town centres. It's clear that the low price point of Mamba and Spice is a key problem. At the cost of as little as £5 for 4 or 5 hits, synthetic cannabis is one of the cheapest drugs on the market, but also one of the strongest. The effects of these drugs can leave users resembling zombies, slumped in a state of semi-consciousness, sometimes foaming at the mouth, sometimes passed out in the street. It's uncomfortable enough seeing this as an adult. It's devastating having to explain to your 4-year-old child while there are people passed out on the ground in the market square in Mansfield town centre. This is clearly having a negative impact on town centres and local economies. It's causing anxiety among shoppers and business owners, decreasing footfall and discouraging families from spending the day in the town centre. It's also adding an extra strain to ambulance services around the country. Figures from South Western Ambulance Service NHS Foundation Trust showed that between August 2016 and July 2017, 157 calls were related to synthetic cannabis. This jumped up to 960 in the following year. Most of the time, the users hop back up after 20 minutes or so, absolutely fine, don't need an ambulance, and that time and money is wasted. It's not an issue that only affects my constituents in Mansfield and Warsaw, it impacts on constituencies around the UK, and an issue that's getting increasingly worse. The government needs to act now to stop this from worsening further. Well, I'd echo... I will give way.
Thank the honourable member for giving way and congratulate him on securing this debate. In the points he makes about the ambulance service, would he be interested to know that certainly last summer, last year we saw in Torquay, some users were getting 2 or even 3 ambulance visits a day because of the very issue that he's citing, that you recover afterwards. But which again goes to really reinforce that this is not a Class B drug. This looks like a Class A drug, it works like a Class A drug, and it should be a Class A drug.
Well, thank you for that intervention. I totally agree, and I've seen examples myself. One of the prime spots, if you like, for using these particular drugs in Mansfield Town Centre is next to a statue right outside my office. And actually, one of my members of staff has been out there giving, resuscitating people on a regular basis. The challenge being, of course, that not only do they send an ambulance, which isn't necessarily needed, but if that user gets put into the ambulance and taken to A&E, then as a drug user, they often require more resource there in A&E than your average punter as well. So the resource kind of drain from the NHS here is absolutely huge. I agree with him. I'd echo the sentiments of Nottinghamshire County Council that the illegal use of these drugs is a threat to public health and a matter of public concern. As it was outlined by 20 police and crime commissioners, these drugs are causing one of the most severe public health issues we've faced in decades. Quite frankly, for me, enough is enough. I want my constituents in Mansfield and Warsaw to feel safe, and I want the police and local council to have the powers to ensure that users are effectively dealt with. And the localised manufacturing methods of these drugs vary due to the range of different ingredients that dealers use. The variability means the drugs vary in strength and in quality, and the effects of consuming one hit of Mamba from week to week, from dealer to dealer, from town to town, can vary hugely. The symptoms are unpredictable, and as a result, medical intervention can be challenging. After contacting NHS England and NICE, it remains clear that no organisation has taken responsibility yet for best practice in dealing with this issue. I don't believe that each CCG should have to individually come up with its own guidance. The government needs to be proactive and work on a national strategy to tackle what is a growing national problem. These drugs aren't only cheap, but they're also accessible. I've literally seen bags of Mamba lying in the street outside my office. It's not expensive to replace. Current laws and penalties for selling Mamba and Spice mean there isn't a real deterrent for dealers. If I can literally walk down the high street and pick up a bag of it, literally pick it up for free in the street, then clearly people do not fear repercussions of being found or caught with these drugs. Raw ingredients can be found freely available online, ordered to be concocted as Mamba and Spice here in the UK. A recent investigation by the Sunday Times proved how easy it is for UK drugs gangs to import dangerous chemicals from China and to cook up these drugs locally. An undercover reporter was able to import industrial-grade chemicals, including hydrochloric acid and sulfuric acid, to make the drug in just 14 days. And this method means that gangs are making much bigger profits. 50 pounds of ingredients can make 2 pounds of spice worth nearly £10,000. But there needs to be stronger judicial consequences, particularly to manufacturing and dealing these drugs. Currently, profit outweighs the risk. Only by putting the fear of God into manufacturers and cutting off supply lines can we hope to make a tangible impact on the ground. With tougher penalties for dealers and manufacturers will lead to increased prices for users and more powers to the police to protect local residents. A recent conversation with a local police inspector highlighted the enormity of the task when dealing with Mamba users whilst having very restricted powers. Since April this year, one particular Mamba user in Mansfield has been arrested 12 times, sent to prison twice. Whilst in prison, this repeat offender didn't receive any education or rehabilitation, which is a huge missed opportunity in itself, but this led to him immediately breaching his criminal behaviour order after being released by entering Mansfield Town Centre. And I was informed only last week that he was arrested within 24 hours of being released from prison after serving a 16-week sentence, and has consequently received another 8 weeks. There are countless examples like this around the country of people going round and round the system with very lenient consequences to their actions, not getting either the support that they need, but not actually fearing the repercussions of being re-arrested or re-convicted. Following the advice from our right honourable friend, the Policing Minister, I wrote a cross-party letter to the Advisory Council on the misuse of drugs, and I'm pleased that they'll reconsider the classification of psychoactive drugs. This review is due to begin shortly. But more imminently, I'm also aware the Home Office is due to review the operation of the Psychoactive Substance Act this month, in accordance with Section 58, which commits the Home Office to review the operation of the Act within 30 months of its implementation. I look forward to the Government's response on this matter. This is a severe problem which isn't just affecting my constituents in Mansfield and Walsall. It has far-reaching consequences to all areas of society and around the country. I have to praise our local services who are doing their best to deal with this growing epidemic with the resources that are available to them. But it gets to a point where there has to be some national recognition and a plan to reduce the burden on these local services. I'm calling on government to reclassify synthetic cannabinoids so that local authorities have more power to take action, which will get users the help they need and out of the judicial system. It will mean heavier penalties for dealers and increased risk for manufacturers. And from the perspective of the bulk of the public, most importantly, it will keep people safe going about their business in our towns and cities without feeling scared or intimidated. We need to meet a severe problem with severe consequences. But reclassification would also show a clear distinction between synthetic cannabinoids and cannabis. As I've demonstrated numerous times during my speech, the physical and physiological impact of these drugs requires a Class A classification. I understand absolutely that users need support and preventing addiction is a desirable course of action. I welcome the news that the Health Secretary is looking into these preventative services in terms of NHS funding. I raise that side of the coin regularly too, particularly the Department of Health, and I've written to my right honourable friend, the Health Secretary, on this on numerous occasions. Reclassification, as I've said, is not the silver bullet, but it's far too simplistic to believe that all users will want to accept that help, and wrong to think that we shouldn't act when users are making life hell for innocent people and for businesses in town centres. And my first instinct is to protect my constituents. Well, I want Mansfield Town Centre to be a lively, upbeat place again that people look forward to visiting, that will return to time and time again. And Mansfield's full of fantastic local shops and businesses that are facing difficulties of their own already. I'm keen to help regenerate the town centre. I know government is working to support this. We've seen it in the budget through many of the measures that came out this week. But small retail businesses receiving a cut to their business rates won't attract people to their town centres if people feel that the town centre is a hostile environment where they don't want to bring their children. It's not right to let a small minority of people have such a huge impact on entire towns and on the lives of thousands by turning our town centres into places that people fear to go. We can't continue to let our children see this behaviour and think that it's normal. This issue peaked locally in Mansfield and Walsall back in July, at which time I was receiving multiple messages every single day from constituents complaining about their experience with users in the town centre. This problem's worsened over a short space of time, and I don't think we have the ability to wait any longer. If dealers and manufacturers aren't faced with harsh repercussions, then what state will our towns be in this time next year or in 5 years' time? This isn't an issue that can be ignored until it goes away. I'd urge government to look at this closely, to work with the Advisory Council and to reclassify these drugs so we can regain control of our town centres again.
Hear, hear.